This is Out of the Box with your host, Jonathan Clark. Out of the Box, Sunday nights at 9 on Q1043.
Welcome back, Jonathan Clark in the studio. And first I'm going to hold up this book, which is just incredibly awesome. It's Geddy Lee's Big, Beautiful Book of Bass, a compendium of the rare, iconic, and maybe most importantly, weird. This is 408 pages. It is a big coffee table book. There's much more going on in this book, and to talk about that is the author himself, Geddy Lee. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This book is not just about your collection, though. It's, I think, what's your collection up to? Like 200 something basses now, around there?
I'm pushing 260.
Oh,
right now, yeah.
Okay. So we're pushing 300 even.
Don't tell my wife that.
But it's also the history of the instrument. It's hard to believe that I didn't know this, that the electric bass was only mass-produced in 1958? Is that
51.
right?
51
was,
was,
51.
Yeah, 51 was the first, year for commercially available.
Was that Leo Fender?
Yeah, Leo Fender sort of invented the electric bass, although he didn't technically invent it.
Yeah, it was invented sort of in the 30s by somebody else, right?
Well, there was a guy in the West Coast, I think he lived in Seattle area, Paul Tutmark, that invented you could have purchased a electric bass that he had marketed at that time, but it really wasn't very available.
Yeah.
But Leo Fender sort of reimagined it his own way and came up with his own version that was commercially mass-produced.
Right.
And that first one came out in 1951, yeah.
But still, you didn't see a lot of those electric basses like on television shows or anything like that. And a lot, in the early 50s. And I'm just thinking of the guys that had to play bass with the double bass and that the gigs they had to go to carry those things around.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, there's a photograph I use, one of the old Fender ads in the book, where you see it's a case from a double bass that's open, and you see the Fender Precision bass sitting inside it. And it gives you the idea of, my God, what a difference. No, in the early 50s, people looked at it, with a bit of trepidation because they didn't really understand if it could reproduce the tone of the double bass. And if you're a double bass player, you were probably of two minds, because on the one hand, you were probably thinking, I don't need that thing. I can make this baby sound just fine, this big double bass. But on the other hand, you're going, oh my God, every time I go to a gig, I have to strap it to the roof of the van or find some way to get it from gig to gig to gig. And usually those instruments traveled outside the vehicle.
right.
And how much easier would that thing make my life? So I'm sure it was, approached with a bit of a skeptical eye.
And anyone who knows you knows about your interests. They know that you love baseball, you love your Blue Jays vinyl, you love your wine. I think you were even a stamp collector when you were a little kid. Yeah. For the full-on nerds. It's interesting that you and Rush have had been playing for almost 40 years. And at that point, you had not many basses. And then you sort of went on this tear of collecting.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to my insanity. But, for me, the bass was a tool for most of my career. And I only wanted to use basses that fit into my idea for the sound I wanted to achieve, right? It was a sound that served my identity as a bass player. So, I disregarded any instrument that didn't fit into my parameters of how I saw my sound coming across. And so, fast forward, 38 years or whatever it was when I started thinking about the idea of acquiring other basses, and that came after somebody offered to do a swap for one of my stage basses in exchange for a 1953 Fender Precision bass. And I thought about that, and of course, at first I said, well, why do I want that? I'm good. But then I started looking into it, and I realized, wow, that's just the second year of the invention of the thing, really.
Right, pretty much,
and
yeah.
and that was my birth year as well, so I thought, I'm curious. So I went ahead and did that, and I acquired the bass plus another bass at the time. And that set my mind sort of reeling, and I understood that, you know what? I know very little about the evolution and invention of the instrument that I've held in my hands for 42 years. So maybe it's worth checking out. So I got curious, and I said to my tech, Scully, I said, Scully, wouldn't it be fun? And that's, of course, a death sentence for a collector. Wouldn't it be fun to have like maybe a dozen basses, each one representing the basses that my sort of heroes growing up played? Like for Paul McCartney, for example, a Hofner violin bass. For Jack Bruce, an EB3, and on and on. So that was the idea at first. And of course, with me, there's no such thing as a small measure. And before I knew it, boom, I was deep down the rabbit hole, and I was collecting all kinds of fascinating instruments.
But I sort of not at the level that you have achieved, but I sort of got bit by that bug too, because when you collect guitars, for example, which I was trying to do at some point in my life, I haven't really succeeded yet. But those guitars, like the Gibsons and the Fenders, they're sort of like modern art too. You know what I mean? There's like Corvettes or Mustangs.
They totally are. They're really great examples of mid-century art. And one of the motivations for doing the book, among the many motivations I had, was to kind of showcase photographically how unique and beautiful these instruments can be. And I felt also that there's a lot of books out there about guitars and vintage guitars and collecting guitars, but I felt like the books on bass were a bit meager and didn't really show the love that I felt the bass deserved. So I wanted to sort of make a beautiful book. That's why the title is what it is. I didn't intend it to be that big, but
yes,
I got carried away. And
once again, Nick, this is a very big book.
Yeah,
408 pages. I have a bass right there by you that Andrew will show you.
Right.
We have this bass hanging up. It is a Fender P Bass, and yep. I don't know what year it is or where it was made, but the cool thing about it is that Peter Max painted that for us.
It's really cool. That's definitely a wall hanger. You don't want to play that because his paint job will chip off.
Right,
but,
yeah.
This is a Mexican-made precision bass, and the ones that do come out of that factory can be very good as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And Andrew has another bass he'd like to show you.
Okay.
Andrew is a bass player in a local band in the tri-state area.
All right.
But he has a bass which kind of reminded me of an alembic. Okay. Somewhat, and
it's kind of like a Carl Thompson type of thing. I'm sorry, it's a what? A B.
A B bass. It's a 5-string.
Right. It's got active electronics. I see that 5-string. This is one of those big necks. I see all kinds of young players playing these now with 5-string, 6 strings, and big necks.
Yeah.
And they're really so incredibly talented. Sometimes on my Instagram feed on the Explore page, because I'm all about basses, so all kinds of bass players pop up, and I watch some of the videos, and I see kids from all over the world just geeking out on their instruments.
Very talented too. I mean,
Unbelievable.
So many talented.
I think the world of bass players is in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Well, see, when I see something like that, I say Andrew must have huge hands. Because no. But he doesn't. He has normal hands. And in the book, you talk about the sonic differences in 250 or so basses. Great stories from various collectors, beautiful photographs, obviously, and interviews with some of the legendary bass players, like you mentioned, John Paul Jones, U2's Adam Clayton, Bill Wyman from the Stones. And I didn't know this. Did Bill Wyman sort of invent the electric fretless bass?
Yeah, he did.
That's amazing. I did not know that.
Yeah, I know. It's a little known fact, but the first bass that he used before he was in the Stones and when he on the early Stones record was this instrument that he had bought and didn't like the size of, so he took it to I guess it was a friend of his dad's or something who was a carpenter, and had him cut it down, and then he pulled out all the frets in the in the instrument, and he used it as a fretless bass. That was his bass. So
That's amazing.
another friend of mine tells me the story that the reason it's fretless is because he couldn't figure out how to put the frets back in. But I didn't ask Bill that, so I don't know if that's a verifiable story.
Was it hard for you to be the interviewer as opposed to the interviewee?
At first, it was, for sure. Actually, the first interview I did was with Bill, and it was in a restaurant in London. And I'd never done that kind of thing before. And, of course, I have tremendous respect for Bill Wyman. So I was a little edgy that day, a little tight, as they say. But he was so charming, and he's such a great storyteller that I relaxed as the thing went on. And he's got a really fantastic Cockney sense of humor. So,
oh yeah, I bet.
Yeah, he's a funny man.
When I think of fretless, you know who I think of? I think of Tony Levin, and I think of Jaco Pastorius, and Jaco's sort of represented in this book, right?
Yes, he is. Yeah, for sure. There's so many bass players I would have loved to talk to. So many great bass. I could have done nothing but have interviews with bass players, but I really, I didn't have a ton of space left after my massive collection, but I really wanted to have at least 9 or 10 of them in there, and I wanted them to be players that connected to what the book is about, either by virtue of the fact that they were around in the early 60s when these basses were first coming on the market, so they could speak to the atmosphere of the times and what it would have been like to go into a music store in 1961 looking to buy a bass, what was in there, especially when you're talking to someone from Australia like Bob Daisley or from London like John Paul Jones. I thought that was really interesting and would enhance the story of these instruments. Also, I wanted to talk to people that were collectors, people like Jeff Tweedy, who's a big
from Wilco,
collector,
bass player, but no one remembers that, right?
And Bob Daisley was a big collector too, and Adam Clayton is also a collector of instruments. So I have a lot in common with these guys, and so it's fun to share our madness together. So the interview portion really is a way of bringing these instruments to life, to remind people that it's not just wood, metal, plastic. They're bringers of joy. They have brought a living to these people. They're a way of these artists to express themselves. So I think it really helps the context of what people are looking at when they flip through the book.
And the book is just absolutely gorgeous. Give me your top 5 bass players of all time, top of mind right now.
Well, John Entwistle, Jack Bruce, Jaco Pastorius, Jeff Berlin. There's a really obvious one I'm missing, Chris Squire.
Chris Squire, yeah. And all those bass players. I'm thinking of the live version of Crossroads of Cream, when Clapton's just, going into the stratosphere. And you listen to the other channel, and it's Jack Bruce going nuts,
wailing,
soloing.
Yeah.
Which
we talk about fretlesses, and he was a fretless player. He played fretless quite often. He played a fretless Dan Armstrong bass, and I think John Paul Jones told me a story about him when John Paul Jones was a very popular session guy, and he was going into a studio one day, and Jack Bruce was coming out. This is in the early days, and Jack Bruce was coming out holding his double bass. He was a double bass player doing a session, and John Paul Jones was carrying an electric bass, and they stopped and had a word with each other, and he was sort of making fun of the fact that he was playing an electric bass. But the irony of that is, not too long after that, he was one of the world's foremost electric bass players. So.
And obviously those Beatles records, maybe even later when the technology of recording got better, McCartney's bass is so loud on those Beatles songs. And I think of, the song Something or something like that. And he's basically soloing throughout that whole song.
Right. No, I mean, he's a terrific bass player, especially when you consider, these are pop songs essentially. And he was able to write such strong melodies for the bass. And I think that's something that was influenced and born out of the great Motown players, people like James Jamerson and Duck Dunn. And you listen to some of those early songs like My Girl and Ain't No Mountain High Enough. The bass plays a prominent role, not just rhythmically, but melodically. And I think Paul McCartney carried that tradition on.
You didn't get to speak, obviously, with Entwistle, but you did speak with the Who's guitar tech.
Yeah.
Who had some stories, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, he's become a pal, and he's a super interesting guy, a real character. And he's worked for The Who since the 70s, and he helped John build his collection. And John had a very extensive and famous collection that was sold at auction shortly after he passed away. And one of those instruments I was fortunate enough to acquire through Alan, and that's a 61 precision bass, but which I will never change the strings off of.
Of course, right? Yeah, exactly.
But as a rule, I don't really look for basses by famous players. Like I just look for really interesting examples of the instruments and different brands. But the opportunity to have something that one of my heroes played was too great to resist.
And it's interesting in the book you go into, there's sort of two kinds of collecting, I think. There's one where there's the 58 Sunburst Les Paul that somebody's had under their bed for 50 years that they received as a gift. But then there's the other part of the workhorse instruments. I immediately think of Stevie Ray Vaughan's beat up Strat or Sting's. I think that's a P bass. It's completely beat up. Yeah, he plays a mid-50s P bass. I think it's a 56 P bass that he plays. But yeah, that was very much a point. I mean, the book is about basses, it's about bass players, but really it's also about collecting and the craziness of collecting. And there are a few people I interview in the book that are pure collectors, and I think there's a mindset there. But what I wanted to showcase in this book was exactly what you're talking about. Most collectors want that untouched beauty queen, the closet queen they call it, that has sat under a bed for 50 years, as you say. And when you open the case, it's like looking back in time. It's a time capsule. And I get that, and I fall for that too. But what I also love, and what I think is a little underappreciated by collectors, are those Stevie Ray Vaughan, well-used, well-played, single-owner instruments. They haven't been refinished. They're all original, but they show the war wounds of playing in a bar every night, for 30 years, or being someone's main instrument and sometimes someone's only instrument. One of the basses that I have, and one example of that is I have these two basses from 1964, Fender jazz basses. Both of them are Dakota Red, which is a rare color to find in that period. One spent its life under a bed. It's barely been played. It's pristine. And the other one pictured beside it I found in Ireland, and it was owned by a single bass player who played in his own Irish show band, for 45 years. And when I opened the case of that, the first thing that comes out is the smell of cigarettes and beer. Yes. And that thing has war wounds, and oh my God, it took my Tech Scully, weeks to clean that thing up and make it playable. But when you see the two side by side, it really tells such a wonderful story. It is. Geddy Lee's big, beautiful book of bass, a compendium of the rare, iconic, and weird, is in stores now. 2.5 years you spent on this book? Well, from original conception, it was about 2.5 years, but in actual physical work, it's more like 18 months. Okay, all right. So pretty much when the last Rush show ended, you sort of got into it at that point, right? Yeah, I took a break, went traveling with my wife, and then had this idea for the book, and then we started to get more and more serious. We put a little presentation together, and then about a year after the last tour ended, I got serious and got to work. Urban legend has it that there might be another Geddy Lee solo album. I don't even know that myself yet. But, anything is possible. I gotcha. How's Alex? He's great. He wrote the foreword to the book? He wrote the backward. Okay, the backward. I have two forewords. One, a very well-respected Fender expert friend of mine named Terry Foster wrote the foreword. And I really wanted to show both sides of that kind of a book, right? There's the
the guitar nerd side, and yet there's the player side. It's very much a duality. So I wanted a guitar expert, a vintage expert, and I wanted a musician. So I couldn't think of a better musician than the guy I've spent most of my life hanging around with. So.
And Neil's doing great? Everything's
Doing
cool
good,
with
yeah,
Neil?
Everything's good.
The last time that you and I spoke, I suggested this crazy idea that Rush should do something on Broadway.
Right.
And now we have Bruce Springsteen doing it.
Yeah.
So I just have another crazy idea. Rush does one night a month for 12 months on Broadway. One show a month
Okay.
on Broadway for 12 months, and then you're done.
Okay, I'll submit that to
Talk to management.
Yeah.
Do you think the Mets will trade Syndergaard or what?
I would be surprised because they're out there acquiring talent. They're spending money. So why would you? And that's obviously a win now approach. So why would you trade a guy that is a win now guy? So I think he'll stay.
I hope so. Geddy Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun talking.
This is Out of the Box with your host, Jonathan Clark. Out of the Box, Sunday nights at 9 on Q1043.